Hello, romance lovers. Today I have a story for you called I Was the Acting Empress, but I Spent the First Night with Her. Don't forget to support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new interesting stories. Thank you for watching. In a time when the world was plunged into chaos, four brave souls set out on a dangerous quest to destroy the source of evil. Their path was full of deadly trials, but united by a common goal and an unbending will, they defied fate to free the world from eternal darkness. Yet they managed to seal the cursed stone, and their names became legend. The great Emperor Aurelian, whose will was unbreakable, and the Archmage Sabrina, the mistress of ancient magic, went down in history as the saviors of the world. A girl in an elegant dress sat and read a book about the legendary swordmaster Theon and his companions. Her white hair fell softly on her shoulders, shimmering in the sunlight. She sat on the floor of the huge library, surrounded by endless shelves of books, and continued to read about the heroes of the past. Even after 30 years, their brave deeds were still revered by the people, passed down from generation to generation as symbols of courage and hope. Two maids appeared in the doorway, looking at the girl with concern. One of them carefully asked why she kept sneaking into the library, and the other began to explain that the girl was in poor health and could become ill in such a cold and spacious room. Their faces reflected concern and concern. The girl was still sitting, her back turned to them, and continued reading the book as if she had not heard a word. The young lady often caused a lot of trouble with her stubbornness and desire for solitude. But at this moment, she seemed completely immersed in the world of the pages, forgetting about everything around her. Another maid appeared behind the others, sighing wearily and crying out that she had finally found her. She had been searching for the girl all over the house for a long time and had finally found her in the library, hiding among the books. The alarm in her voice was clear. The girl was again somewhere she shouldn't be, especially in such a state. The maid who had just entered called out loudly to the girl named Yana, but she continued to sit with her back turned as if she had not heard her. She was too absorbed in the pages of the book to pay attention to the worried voices behind her. The maid approached Yana and, grabbing her hand, said with a hint of irritation in her voice that she needed to respond when called. She frowned and asked if the girl had any hearing problems. Her voice sounded stern, but there was a hint of fatigue from constant searching and worry. The maid pulled the girl towards herself, insisting that she go to her room immediately. Her voice sounded firm and unyielding, and her gestures betrayed her fatigue from the endless troubles that Yana caused with her disobedience. The maid continued, grumbling that if Yana got sick from the book dust, she would be the one to get punished, and asked the girl not to leave the room without permission. Her voice was stern, but there was concern in it. The other maids watched this scene silently and with obvious anxiety, afraid to interfere once again. The maid nevertheless lifted Yana from the floor, took her hand firmly, and together they headed towards the library exit. The girl reluctantly followed her, occasionally glancing back at the abandoned book, as if not wanting to part with the world she loved so much. The maid, continuing to lead Yana by the hand, wearily noted that she did not understand why she was so interested in the story of the traitor. There was bewilderment and slight irritation in her voice. The girl only silently looked at her with her large blue eyes, full of impenetrable calm, as if the answer was hidden in her gaze. But in this story, in addition to the four heroes, there was another character, the one who betrayed them. His name has almost disappeared from the people's memory, but his act will forever remain a part of history. He was the one who stood next to them at the decisive moment, but instead of loyalty, he chose darkness, changing the fate of the heroes and the entire world. In an attempt to gain as much power as possible, he betrayed his comrades, hoping to gain a power that would change his destiny forever. However, his betrayal resulted not only in a loss of trust, but also in a hostility that would haunt him for many years. But who would have thought that the story that everyone knows so well was actually a setup? Where to begin? Everything seemed clear and obvious, but as it turned out, not everything was as the legends claimed. Secrets were hidden in the shadows, and those who considered themselves heroes could be just pawns in someone's cruel game. In reality, there were 5 heroes. The 5th was forgotten in legends, erased from the people's memory. In the girl's hands, a glowing circle shone, filled with power, like the last hope for salvation. But in her chest, a sword was thrust, the hilt of which was tightly gripped by a dark-haired man. His face was cold and impenetrable. The girl watched in surprise, thin trickle of blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. At that moment, she heard a quiet, bitter apology from the dark-haired man. Her name was Lynn, and her gaze froze with a silent question that had no answer. A precious stone slipped from the girl's hands. It shone with a soft, mesmerizing light, and its light purple color seemed alive, as if hidden energy was pulsating inside the stone. The brunette in the blue suit looked at the girl, his eyes full of heaviness and determination. In a cold but firm voice, he said that otherwise the world would not be saved. His words hung in the air like a fatal warning from which there was no escape or turning away. The girl pressed herself exhaustedly against the cold floor, laid out with rough stone. The icy surface made her shiver, but she barely noticed it. She couldn't comprehend what exactly her comrade was doing, and why everything had suddenly gone so terribly and wrong. She couldn't speak. Her throat was tight with terror. Vague thoughts flitted through her mind, but one became increasingly clear. He had used poison. Her face was contorted with pain and fear, her eyes wide open, trying to comprehend what was happening. Her chest was tight, and her heart was pounding, unable to understand why he had betrayed them. Was this guy really only after the gemstone from the start? The girl's thoughts raced in search of an answer, but her strength was leaving her. He stood before her, tightly clutching the bloody sword in his hand. The light purple gem, as if alive, slowly rolled to the side, moving away from them, its glow still illuminating the dark room. And suddenly, a woman's hand appeared from the darkness, smoothly reaching for the light purple stone. Her movements were cautious but decisive, as if she was afraid of scaring away something invisible. A slight glow from the stone illuminated graceful fingers, ready to grab the treasure, while all eyes were riveted on each other. The wounded girl looked up with difficulty and noticed the figure of her friend, Sabrina. Her eyes widened in surprise and hope, mixed with a shadow of doubt. Sabrina was the one who was now reaching for the stone. Her face remained focused, and her eyes burned with a strange determination. But why is she here? Sabrina, a slender blonde with piercing eyes, frowned at the scene. In her hands was now a light purple gemstone that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She clutched it tightly, as if afraid that someone might snatch it from her. Lynn struggled to scream a warning through the weight of pain and weakness. Her voice was hoarse, but full of desperation. She wanted to warn Sabrina to run immediately. If he was a traitor, then there was nothing stopping him from hurting her too. The words caught in her throat, but her eyes said more than any scream. But instead of running away, Sabrina said something that Lynn could not have expected. Her voice was cold, almost emotionless, but there was praise in it. The girl could not believe her ears. Her eyes widened in shock and horror, and her weak body seemed to freeze in tension. She could not understand why her friend stood on the side of the one who betrayed them all. Sabrina stood next to the man named Tion, her face serious and cold. She looked at the injured Lynn. Her voice was quiet but firm as she addressed her friend, saying that she was so sorry that Lynn had to go through this. The words sounded like a farewell, but there was no real comfort in them. Sabrina smiled lightly, her face suddenly soft, as if all the tension had gone. She looked at Lynn and said with cold confidence that she would take care of the rest. Her voice was calm. There was a note of something sinister in it. This smile, instead of comforting, only increased the fear and confusion in the girl's eyes. Lynn raised her head with difficulty. Her body was paralyzed by pain, but this did not prevent her gaze from filling with fear. She looked at Sabrina, not believing what she was hearing. The friend she considered close suddenly seemed alien, and her words, frightening. The girl began her story about the stone. As is known, for the last 10 years, she had been looking for a way to destroy the cursed stone. She had a great responsibility, because the destruction of this stone could free entire lands from the tyranny of the ancient evil that it hid within itself. She took the sword from the boy and continued her story, not paying attention to him. The longer the girl looked for a way to destroy the cursed stone, the harder her time became. No matter how hard she tried, she always came to the same exit. She knew that everything she did was leading her to an inevitable end. With this realization, she took a decisive step forward, gripping the sword in her hands and approaching the girl. There was determination in her eyes. She was ready to do what was necessary to end the curse. The complete destruction of the stone is simply impossible. she said, and her voice sounded like an echo of inevitable tragedy. As she spoke, her face changed. A dark determination appeared in her eyes that made the world around her seem to freeze. She began to look frightening, as if her very being was beginning to change under the weight of this truth. The wounded girl's body trembled. She felt fear grip her when she saw her opponent's changed face. The sword in her hands now seemed like a symbol of destruction, and she herself was not just a person, but a threat capable of destroying everything in her path. The girl raised her tired gaze, her eyes clouded with pain and fatigue. She did not understand what was happening and what brought her here. Everything seemed alien and distant, as if she had found herself in another world, where every action was filled with mystery and danger. Sabrina continued her story, confidently saying that she knew what to do. "There is a way," she said, "that we found not long ago. To destroy the stone, you must sacrifice a soul." The words sounded like a sentence, and the girl felt the weight of the choice fall upon her. The girl did not understand why they had decided to sacrifice her out of all of them. Her heart sank with pain and fear, and unable to bear it, she asked, "Why me?" There was desperate confusion in her voice, and she greedily sought an answer that could ease her soul a little. The girl leaned towards her and, looking into her eyes, asked, "Do you really want to know this?" She looked very intimidating. Her voice was quiet, but there was a weight to the words. "Do you understand? Each of us has families waiting for us, and you're an orphan." These words echoed in the wounded girl's head like a heavy accusation. She couldn't understand why they were doing this to her, why they had chosen her for this horrific sacrifice. Her heart sank with bitterness, and confusion froze in her eyes. Sabrina, with tears in her eyes, quietly said that she would let everyone know that this was her choice, and that she would be remembered for many years to come. Her voice was filled with pain and regret, but also with determination. She knew that this sacrifice was not only hers, but the last hope for everyone. She approached the man and he hugged her. The girl did not understand why Sabrina was crying, although she herself was ready to make such a sacrifice. Tion, seeing her confusion, encouraged her, saying that Lin would understand why they did this. His words were full of confidence, but there was anxiety in them. The girl agreed with him that he was right and that she should not give in to weakness. Lin thought and lay silently on the cold floor, feeling how her body was pierced by the cold, and her thoughts wandered in the fog. She heard their conversations, but she could not find the strength to intervene. Every word seemed alien and distant. After 7 long years together, it turned out that she was nobody to them. All the support and promises that sounded in their conversation turned out to be just an illusion. When the moment came when she needed protection, none of the 4 comrades stood by her side. The girl, walking towards her, said that she could blame her, and smiling, swung her sword at her. "It is time for you to die for the sake of peace," she said, her words full of cold determination. At that moment, silence hung in the air, like a premonition of something inevitable, and the girl felt how each step she took brought her closer to the final decision. But a strange smile appeared on the girl's face before her death, just like on the faces of her comrades. It was a smile full of despair and anger, but also some kind of painful acceptance. She did not feel fear, only a feeling that her life had perhaps been predetermined many years ago. Does she want to live? Perhaps her decision was not so much about life, but about revenge for all the betrayals and suffering. Or is she hungry for power, hoping that this moment will open up new horizons for her? It is possible that there is something deeper behind her actions. Perhaps she has made a secret agreement. Again, the little girl sat with an empty gaze, as if absorbed in her thoughts, not noticing what was happening around her. Her eyes were empty, like 2 abysses, in which neither pain nor joy was reflected. At this time, the same maid called her, trying to bring her back to reality. But the girl seemed to be too far from everything that was happening. The maid gently asked the girl to eat, placing a bowl of soup in front of her. On the table in front of the girl lay hot mushroom soup, its steam rising into the air, creating the illusion of warmth. However, the girl continued to look ahead, her gaze empty and detached, as if she could not see either the food or the service itself. The maid got tired of waiting and, slightly irritated, asked the girl to say if she didn't want to eat so she could clear the dishes. There was weariness in her voice because she had been trying to persuade the girl to eat for a long time. But she still sat with an empty look, not reacting to the maid's words. The girl did not understand why everything was like this. Her gaze showed thoughts about her past and new life. She tried to find meaning in what was happening, but everything seemed vague and incomprehensible. Thoughts about what had happened before and what awaited her mixed together, creating a heavy uncertainty in her soul. The girl didn't understand why the maid was so concerned about how and when she ate, but after a pause, she said quietly, "I'm sorry." The words were full of unspoken emotions: regret, loss, and perhaps guilt. Her voice was weak, almost invisible, as if she were trying to find words to explain something that couldn't be explained. The maid put her hand on her hip and, slightly irritated, told the girl to do as she was told. Her voice became sharper and she began to complain, but her words trailed off, finding no response in the girl's empty gaze. The girl literally vomited from the maid's indignation. Her body could not withstand the tension caused by these words, which seemed to hit her very being. The maid fell silent, stunned by what had happened, and the girl, trembling, raised her eyes with difficulty but could not say a word. The maid began to complain again, not paying attention to the girl's condition. Her voice became louder, full of irritation. Meanwhile, the girl was silently drying herself with a towel. Her face remained indifferent. She no longer tried to answer, as if the maid's words no longer had any meaning for her. The girl thought that the maid was too loud, and irritation began to rise inside her. For a moment, a daring thought flashed through her mind. She is a forgotten hero, a victim of a grand legend whose name was once spoken with reverence, but now drowned in the shadows of time. Lin, period. The one who was once ready to give everything for others found himself buried under the weight of oblivion and indifference. The girl was bent over in pain, sitting on a chair. Her stomach hurt so much that she had difficulty breathing, and her body felt alien and uncontrollable. She did not understand what was happening to her, why these strange sensations had taken hold of her. Her thoughts were confused, and her weakness was growing, as if her strength was going somewhere irretrievably. The girl bowed her head and turned to the maid, whose name was Ola. Her voice was quiet, but there was a note of insistence in it. "Did you bring the newspaper I asked for?" To which she turned around sharply, snorting in irritation. "No." "Why do you need it anyway?" Her tone was full of reproach, as if she was trying to prove that the request was completely useless. The girl didn't understand why Ola kept adding caustic comments, or who allowed the maid to behave like that. Instead of simply fulfilling the request, she always found a reason to reproach her. The girl watched her silently until Ola, having softened a little, said that she would bring the newspaper but asked her to wait a little. After a while, the girl saw the newspaper fall on the table in front of her. The maid threw it down with slight irritation without saying a word and immediately went about her business, as if to show that it was a trifle for her, not worth paying attention to. The girl immediately picked up the newspaper and began to examine it. The lines printed on the yellowed paper reported the current year, 232. She froze for a moment, realizing that exactly 32 years had passed since the day it all began. And now she found herself in the body of a completely different girl. The girl had terrible health problems. But what was even worse was the way others treated her. Even the maid showed no respect, as if she was something unnecessary, something that could be ignored or neglected. The girl felt terrible. Everything in her life, both the past and this one, was going wrong. She couldn't understand why her world was always full of pain, injustice, and alienation. In her past life, she may have dreamed of better things, but all her efforts were wasted. And now, in this girl's body, she was trapped again, where every day brought disappointment. The girl was sure that these traitors lived happily ever after. The Archmage and the Swordmaster were the ones who killed her in her past life. They had probably long forgotten about her, continuing their lives full of success and recognition. It was no wonder that they were revered here, in this world, where their strength and status decided everything. The girl looked at the newspaper with a determined look, her eyes shining with a firm conviction. She knew that this would not just remain like this. Determination was seething inside her. If she was destined to return, she was not going to allow these traitors to continue their lives without consequences. Her eyes were full of determination. The bead of malice is a strange black object of unknown origin that hides unimaginable power. It was surrounded by mysticism and fear, because it is known that it is able to fulfill one wish of its owner. However, the wish had to be paid for. Those who dared to use the bead of malice to fulfill their wish invariably became its masters. But this power was not a gift, but rather a curse. Every wish fulfilled by the bead of malice turned its owner into a veritable messenger of disaster. With each passing day, his soul became emptier and darker, and his actions brought only destruction and suffering. The desire to possess the bead did not fade. A brutal war began in the struggle for it, leading to innocent victims and destruction. No one realized that a terrible price would have to be paid for the fulfillment of the desire, and those who sought power became its slaves. They and their comrades were chosen to destroy the bead and put an end to chaos. They faced many trials along the way. The comrades suffered, fought, reconciled, and made mistakes. But despite all the difficulties, they became stronger and better, gradually realizing their mission. For 7 years, they worked hard, overcoming difficulties and not giving up to fulfill their mission. But at the end, betrayal awaited her. At the most decisive moment, when they were close to their goal, they abandoned her to her fate. The girl hadn't really thought about it, but now that she was thinking about it, the details began to become clear in her head. Everything that had happened seemed to make no sense, but now that she was looking at the events from a different perspective, it became clear to her that everything was part of a much larger game. It was some kind of cheap farce. Everything around seemed unreal, like a scene. Seemed to be playing his part, trying to look worthy, but his silence and inaction spoke volumes. While Sabrina was striving for her goal, sacrificing everyone, death was nearby, and it remained inevitable. But she would not leave it like that. Lynn sat there, lost in thought, trying to make sense of everything that had happened to her. She couldn't understand what this contract she had made was, or why her soul was trapped in the body of a little girl. Every memory, every experience felt alien and incomplete, as if her life was just a part of something bigger that she couldn't figure out. The feeling that she was stealing her future didn't leave Lynn. She felt like her presence in this girl's body was taking away her chance at a normal life. Every step, every breath was a reminder that she shouldn't be here. A feeling of guilt grew inside her that she couldn't get out of her head. Lynn wondered where the soul of the owner of this body, the little girl, had gone. She felt that something was wrong, because her own presence in the body of an alien personality could not be an accident. This question tormented her, and she could not get rid of the thought that there was something more connected to this soul than just a change of bodies. The maid turned to Lynn, sternly warning her to keep her head down. Her voice was full of hidden irritation, as if she knew that the girl was being too curious and that it could lead to trouble. The maid sighed heavily and said that the girl's antics had been causing her more problems lately. She was clearly irritated, and Lynn felt her actions starting to backfire. This added even more questions. The girl looked at the maid in surprise, not understanding what she was talking about, although such accusations were heard quite often. While Yana tried to sort out her thoughts, remembering what she could have done, Ola continued to demand an explanation. The maid's voice became louder and more insistent, and her irritation was clearly growing. The maid reproachfully reminded him that only a couple of days ago the girl had snuck into the young master's greenhouse. Her voice sounded irritated, as if this event had become a personal burden to her. Yana froze in surprise, not understanding how she could have done something like that. She tried to remember, but she had no memories of it. Ola, however, was not going to back down, increasingly insistent on an explanation for her antics. As it turned out, the girl had stolen a heavenly fruit, a rare and valuable treasure grown in a greenhouse. The girl was shocked by this fact. Her eyes widened and her thoughts became confused. She could not believe that she was being accused of stealing a heavenly fruit. Her heart began to beat faster because it sounded like something completely alien to her nature. Yana did not know how to justify herself because she herself did not understand how this could happen. The heavenly fruit was a deadly fruit that a fragile girl shouldn't even touch. Yana froze in horror, realizing the possible consequences. Had she really eaten it? The thought seemed impossible. But what if it was true? Her eyes darted around, and in her head she wondered, how did did she get to this point, and what would happen now? The maid angrily glared at the girl, not hiding her irritation. Her voice grew louder and her words sharper. Ola continued to be indignant, accusing Yana of recklessness and declaring that such a prank could lead to a catastrophe. The girl just sat there, clenching her fists, not knowing what to say in her defense. The maid sternly told the girl to eat, reminding her that she had barely survived after what had happened. Yana silently looked at the food, trying to comprehend the situation. In her past life, she herself had maids who unquestioningly followed her orders. Ola continued to complain, now screaming because of the girl's appetite. Yana was shocked. Did an ordinary maid have the right to behave like that? She could not understand how it happened that she, a girl who ended up in this body, was subjected to such treatment. The maid seemed to have lost control of herself, and her rudeness was shocking, the girl thought, trying to find the right words to somehow answer the maid. But all that came out of her mouth was, I'm sorry. The words sounded so weak and defenseless that she herself felt the uncertainty shackle her. It was not what she wanted to say, but nothing else came to mind. An apology escaped her again, though she hadn't intended to say it. This child apologized even for things she hadn't done, and now she felt the habits of the past taking over. Her soul had changed, but her body remembered everything. It was hard to believe that these reactions, which she had no control over, would haunt her forever. The girl clenched her fists in anger. She was constantly forced to apologize, even when she didn't want to. But now it had gotten even worse. She had been pushed to the point where she ate a poisonous fruit. Anger overwhelmed her because she felt trapped, unable to change what was happening, and it was even more painful to realize that no one was going to help her. She couldn't continue this. She had to say something to the maid. A storm of emotions was growing inside her. Anger, despair, a desire to end this. The girl knew she had to say something that would put an end to this situation, but the words wouldn't come. The maid, as always, repeated her signature phrase, "Just do as you're told." The girl felt irritation growing inside her, but "sorry" came out again. She didn't mean it, but the words just kept coming out. It felt weak, and she hated herself for it, but she couldn't help it. The maid coldly informed her that the second lady would be arriving soon, and that the girl should tidy herself up. The girl again felt the words of apology forming on her lips, although she did not want to say them. "I'm sorry," escaped from her, and she again felt that helpless feeling, as if she were being controlled and not given the right to her own emotions. The maid began to complain again, saying that it was because of the girl that she had to endure the most. These words infuriated the little lady. Anger filled her heart, and she could no longer hold back. All this time she had been humiliated and complained about, but now she felt that she had reached her limit. "Shut up." These words burst out of the girl, and the maid, surprised, froze, only watched her. Never before had she heard such a thing from the little lady. The girl sat, clenching her fists, and although her heart was pounding with rage, she felt that she had finally said what had been building up inside her for a long time. The maid asked again, not believing her ears, but the girl twisted in her chair as if in pain, and clutched her stomach with one hand. The sharp pain made it difficult for her to breathe, but the inner anger continued to boil inside her, despite everything. She was not going to retreat, although her body could not stand it, and her mind was overwhelmed by conflicting feelings. "I'm sick of you." These words escaped the girl through the pain, but there was no weakness or doubt in her voice. She was not going to retreat, despite the painful sensations in her body. Anger overwhelmed her, and despite the physical pain, she was determined. Now she did not intend to allow the maid to continue to behave like this. The girl raised her head with a smile, catching the maid's gaze, and noticing her surprise, asked, "What are you staring at?" Her voice was firm and her gaze was sharp. The maid froze, but the girl did not give her time to react and ordered, "Lower your gaze." She felt everything inside her boiling with tension and anger. The maid looked at her angrily, her face hard with anger. She clenched her teeth but remained silent, seeing that the girl was not going to give in. The atmosphere became even more tense, and although the maid was in a conflict mood, the girl felt that she had finally gained confidence and was not going to give in. The girl sighed inside, feeling the weight lift off her shoulders. She had finally said it, the words she had been holding back for so long. She knew it was probably just the first step, but now she didn't feel so weak and helpless. She thought, thank heavens I can still do something, as she felt her strength slowly leaving her body. The maid asked again, clearly not understanding what was happening, and there was anger and confusion in her voice. The girl felt her body becoming weaker and weaker, but inside she felt that she could not allow herself to give up. The girl tried to fight the darkness, but her body did not obey. Her strength was leaving her, and the world around her was becoming increasingly blurry. The last images appeared in her eyes. The maid, her rage, but all this gradually disappeared, absorbed by the abyss. She tried to hold on, but the feeling of peace and fatigue became stronger. She saw her old self again, but now her name was Lynn. It was the same image, the same person that she had once known. The look was confident, but at the same time full of doubt, as if she were once again confronted with her own past, which now seemed so distant and alien. She was back in her old body, and for a moment she felt unreal. Was this a dream? But everything was so tangible. Her movements, her sensations, even the air around her seemed familiar. Perhaps this was just a moment when reality and fantasy intertwined, or perhaps she had returned to where she had left. She saw the girl in whose body she was in reality. The girl was walking down a long corridor, her steps echoing in the silence. Lynn watched her, feeling a strange interweaving of her feelings. She could not understand whether this was her past or her present, but everything seemed strange and familiar at the same time. And then she heard a voice explaining who the girl was. It said that she was the illegitimate daughter of her late eldest son. Lynn froze, unable to place the voice. It was like an echo, like a whisper coming from nowhere, but so clear that she couldn't ignore it. The voice continued, each word a heavy weight. It said what everyone else was saying. The girl was a burden to the family. Despite the death of her parents, she was still treated as a young lady. But so what? After all, her biological mother was of low status, and the girl should not even dream of inheriting. The words echoed in Lynn's mind. The girl listened thoughtfully, and the voice continued, as if not noticing her confusion. It said that she should at least be grateful that she was being raised by her second and third sons. After all, she was just a quiet and hesitant niece, who had not earned any special attention or respect. The last words of the voice were cold and merciless. It would be better if she just disappeared and did not ruin the family's reputation. These words echoed in Lynn's mind, leaving a bitter aftertaste. She felt her heart squeeze and her breath catch. This was not just an opinion, but a sentence from which there was no escape. The girl looked at the little girl one last time, who continued to wander down the hallway with a lost look. Her image seemed to blur, gradually losing clarity. Lynn felt herself beginning to return to reality, as if she was being pulled out of the kingdom of Morpheus. The dream was leaving, but it left behind many questions. The girl woke up from the soft rays of the sun breaking through the thin curtains. She felt the weight of her body and was surprised to realize that she was in the form of a small blonde again. Her hair was touching her face in light waves. This body still seemed alien, but she had no choice. She slowly pulled back the blanket and sat up, looking at herself. Small, pale hands, thin legs. Everything reminded her that this body did not belong to her. Her gaze slid around the room, full of alien things. It was as if she were looking at the world through glass, feeling like she was not part of this place, but someone from the outside. The girl looked around, her gaze stopping at one point in the room. Despite the obvious signs of fatigue, her face still retained something unusually cute. Thoughtfulness and melancholy flashed in her eyes, but the light sunlight falling on her softened this image, giving it an almost fragile tenderness. The dawn was breaking through the window, its soft light filling the room. The girl realized that she had been unconscious for much longer than she had expected. Time seemed to be slipping away from her, leaving her feeling tired and slightly confused. She wondered if the experience had been a dream, but the dream was so vivid and realistic that it seemed part of her reality. This made the girl think and feel even more puzzled. Where does the dream end and the truth begin? Maybe these were Yana's memories? The girl thought about it because everything seemed so real. If this was really her past, then who was this little girl before her? And why did she see everything right now? Questions swarmed in her head, giving her no peace. She looked down at her small hands. She was an orphan now, an illegitimate child with a mother of low status, a stain on her bloodline, an unwanted member of the family, tolerated only because of ancient traditions. The thought weighed heavily on her, stirring a mixture of resentment and determination. The girl thought, now all she could do was adapt to those around her, hide her thoughts and feelings. She understood that her position in this world was too precarious to go against the current. But deep inside, a desire to change her fate was growing, even if she didn't yet know how. She clenched her fists in anger, her nails dug into her palms, but she didn't care. She closed her eyes and tried to collect her thoughts. Why was everything going like this again? Why did she have to live someone else's life, obey someone else's rules? She threw herself on the bed, burying her face in the pillow. Thoughts were whirling in her head. She had lost consciousness. But that had happened because she had finally done something unusual, something that went against her usual submissiveness. And she had succeeded. The thought warmed her from within, giving her a tiny spark of hope. Relaxed on the bed, she lay with her eyes closed, thinking about what had happened. If she kept this up, she thought, maybe she could overcome this inner pain and work through the trauma. It was just a small step, but it gave her confidence that change was possible. The girl noticed that this family had a truly impressive pedigree. The mansion she found herself in was majestic, with high ceilings, expensive carpets, and exquisite decor, which emphasized the status and wealth of the owners. Everything around reminded of the antiquity and strength of this family. The maid bursts into the room, her footsteps loud on the floor, and she starts screaming in irritation. The girl flinched in surprise and opened her eyes, meeting the gaze of the evil maid. She felt everything inside her tense up, but she tried not to show weakness. The girl reluctantly rose from the bed and asked the maid what was the matter. The maid replied with irritation that there was no time for explanations and ordered her to get up quickly. The girl felt her nerves begin to tensely stretch, but she tried to calm down and obey. The maid grabbed the girl's face tightly, as if trying to examine her from head to toe. The girl looked at her in surprise, not understanding what was happening. Why was the maid acting like this? A mixture of confusion and displeasure flashed in her gaze, but she did not know how to react. The maid began to paint the girl despite her resistance. She insisted that it was necessary to look at least a little decent, because the second lady was already on her way. Yana, not hiding her irritation, thought that the maid had completely lost her mind. Why was she forced to do this if she was not even able to understand what was happening? The girl slowly stood up, clutched the sheet in her hands, and despite her anger, quietly apologized to the maid. Her words sounded mechanical, as if she could not control them. Everything in her life again seemed alien and incomprehensible. A tear appeared in the girl's eyes, either from the weight of what was happening, or from the internal pain that she could not hold back. This small drop seemed to symbolize everything that she was experiencing in this body, in this world into which she was forced to fit. The girl, feeling a surge of anger and despair, suddenly jumped up and rushed to the side. The maid, stunned, shuddered and screamed, trying to stop her. But the girl was already rushing away, not paying attention to her screams. The maid continued to shout after her, demanding that the girl stop, but she did not listen. Every word the maid spoke was mingled with her anger and despair. The girl felt her heart beat faster as she continued to run, the girl thought, holding the teapot in her hands. The maid's words about the second lady remained in her head like a riddle. Who was this second lady? Perhaps she was some important figure in this house, or her appearance would change something in the girl's life. It could be that the second lady was someone she would have to meet in the future. The girl continued to drink the water, tasting its bitterness on her tongue, but it didn't matter anymore. She thought that now was not the time for useless arguments and verbal battles. She needed to use her chance and act, not paying attention to the little things. After all, she hadn't yet learned how to behave properly, but that didn't mean she should stay on the sidelines. The maid grabbed the girl's hand, holding back her anger. Despite her weakness, the little one already felt the inner strength to resist. If she couldn't speak, she would stand up for herself with her actions. The woman entering the room attracted attention with her majestic appearance. Her wheat-colored hair perfectly matched her purple dress, emphasizing her exquisite taste and high position. She She looked confident and elegant, and her gaze was focused as she asked what was going on, sensing the uneasiness in the atmosphere. The teapot slipped from the girl's hands and fell with a loud clang right at the feet of the second lady. The girl stood there with a frightened look, not knowing how to react to what had happened. The woman looked up at the girl, remaining motionless as if assessing the situation. The tension in the room became almost palpable. The woman looked at the girl with pity, her gaze full of concern. But she couldn't help but notice how the maid was roughly holding the girl's hand. She didn't understand what was happening, but her intuition told her that something was wrong. The woman with her wheat-colored hair and a purple dress looked at the girl and the maid with a puzzled expression. With slight irritation, she asked, "What's going on?" Her gaze was full of confusion, not understanding why the girl was being held so roughly, and the situation looked so strange. The maid quickly let go of the girl's hand, looking worried. She began to justify herself, trying to explain her behavior, but her words sounded nervous, as if she was not quite sure how she should react to the attentions of the second lady. The maid's words about the girl just causing a bit of a stir angered her. The girl felt irritation growing inside her. Her face became cold and determined. She was not going to allow herself to be humiliated and have her feelings ignored again. The girl stepped back from the maid and, despite all her feelings, forced out, "I'm sorry." These words, which she absolutely did not want to say, escaped as if out of habit, as if her body was acting on old programs, even if her mind resisted. The girl felt tears welling up in her eyes as she stood before the maid. She couldn't explain why, but her heart was clenched with fear and uncertainty. "I don't want to be scolded," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. She apologized again, though she had no idea what for. Why did she always apologize? The maid, noticing the tears in the girl's eyes, quickly changed her expression and looked at her with panic. She clearly felt that everything she did was only making the situation worse. She tried to stop the girl, but realizing that her actions only led to further apologies, she realized that this only made things worse. The girl continued to justify herself. "I really didn't want to wear makeup," she repeated, feeling her inner unease grow with each word. "I'm sorry I didn't listen," she added, as if these words would lessen her guilt. There were tears in her eyes, but she couldn't stop because her body remembered only one thing: to apologize. The woman looked at the girl with pity, her eyes full of worry. She did not understand what was happening to the girl, whose words were uncertain and whose behavior was strange and overly shy. The woman did not know what exactly provoked this state, but she felt that the girl was in great need of support. The girl, feeling completely helpless, fell to her knees. Her eyes were full of tears, and her heart sank with fear and despair. The maid stood nearby, not knowing how to react to what was happening. At this time, the second lady, unable to restrain herself, screamed in horror, looking at the girl and called her again, trying to understand what had happened and how to help her, the girl thought, and tears rolled down her cheeks. She tried to say something several times, but the words wouldn't come, as if something was burning her from the inside. Her heart was filled with pain and resentment, and the feeling of bitterness wouldn't let go. Everything was burning inside, and she didn't know how to express this chaos of emotions. The girl felt her body weakening again, and she realized that she needed to drink some water quickly. But before she could take a step, her shoulder was suddenly touched by the second lady. This touch brought her out of her reverie, and she automatically looked up, waiting for a reaction. The woman looked at the girl with an anxious look, who continued to sit on her knees as if unable to get up. Her face was pale and her eyes were full of worry. She took a step forward and asked carefully, "Yana, are you okay?" Her voice was filled with genuine concern and worry. She saw how the girl was barely standing on her feet. The woman leaned closer to the girl, her voice soft and full of concern. "What did the maid Ola make you do?" she asked, carefully studying the girl's expression. The girl, unable to contain her emotions, stared at one point, and tears rolled from her eyes. She could not find the words to explain what was happening. She, in turn, was silent, absorbed in her thoughts. Her attention was focused on the reactions of the maid and the second lady, as if every gesture and word they made could change something in the current situation. The silence was heavy. Every glance exerted pressure, but she did not dare to say anything. The girl, standing in front of the second lady, began to apologize again. had no strength to say more, she said with a trembling voice, "I'm sorry I made such a noise. It's all my fault." She looked down, feeling her heart grow heavy, and she couldn't hold back her tears. The girl was still sitting on the floor, clutching her other hand, and continued, trying to hold back her tears. Ola said that the second lady would come soon, and I had to hide that I was feeling bad. She made me put on makeup. Her eyes were full of despair, and her voice trembled with pain and helplessness. The girl said that she refused because she didn't want to, but she only made things worse. The maid, hearing these words, realized that she would feel bad from the second lady, and began to justify herself, giving in to panic. Her voice became nervous, and she tried to find an excuse for her actions, although she understood that now it did not matter. The second lady sat down next to the girl and hugged her, trying to calm her down. The girl felt warmth and care, and her heart calmed down a little. At this time, the maid began to justify herself, her voice trembling, and she hurried to explain that she did not want to cause the girl any inconvenience or suffering. The girl looked at the second lady, who frowned, and uncertainty began to creep into her mind. She wondered what she should do now, how she should react to everything that was happening. It seemed that she was standing at a crossroads, and every step she took could change everything. The girl's name came out of the woman's beautiful lips, and at that moment she felt her heart beat faster. She didn't know what would happen next, but a feeling of uncertainty enveloped her completely. All she could do was wait, watching the second lady's reaction. The second lady looked at the girl. Her gaze was firm, but not without concern. She asked in a serious tone if the girl was sure of her words, making her feel the gravity of the situation. The girl flinched, not expecting such a reaction, and tried to collect her thoughts. The girl didn't know what would happen next, but something inside her told her that everything would soon change. She felt a slight tension, as if the air around her was filled with mystery. Her thoughts wandered, and although she couldn't yet comprehend what exactly awaited her, the feeling that important answers were close grew stronger. No matter how capricious the girl was, the servant had no right to treat the lady so impudently and disrespectfully. Her status and upbringing demanded restraint and respect from her, no matter how difficult the young lady's character was. There were strict rules in this house, and breaking them could lead to serious consequences. The girl wondered what punishment would be appropriate for the maid. She went over the options in her head, trying to choose the one that best suited the offense. At that moment, her hands felt the soft fabric of the dress, and she mechanically picked it up. Ola, the second lady's loyal assistant, always enjoyed her trust, and her decisions were rarely questioned. However, the case of the girl raised questions. Although Yana was illegitimate, she was still the daughter of the deceased eldest son, and this gave her a special status that could not be ignored. The second lady looked at the girl with a soft but sincere expression. With love and care, she asked the girl to answer honestly, assuring her that she would always be on her side, no matter what. These words gave the girl some comfort, and she felt that she could trust. The girl thought about it, feeling doubt. Her gaze darkened as she remembered that it was the second lady who had placed Ola's maid by her side. This made her doubt the lady's sincerity. It was hard to believe that she would actually be on her side when she had probably created the situation she was in now. The girl quietly said to herself, "You can act kind on the outside, but no one knows what's inside." Those words described the second lady perfectly. On the outside, she seemed sweet and caring, but the girl couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else hidden behind that kindness. Maybe even unconscious cruelty or cold calculation. The picture before the girl reminded her of the past. The second lady was leaning towards her, while the maid stood behind her like a shadow, reminding her of old, unhealed wounds. But suddenly, images appeared in her imagination. Two comrades who once stood next to her, ready to kill her. They were as confident as this woman was now. The girl remembered the words she had heard once, in the past. "I will have to, Lynn, die for the sake of peace." These words, spoken with such confidence and cheerful smiles, now sounded like a blow to the heart. She again felt how her soul was covered with cold, because behind it there were not only promises, but also lies. The words pierced her like a cold knife, sending shivers down her spine. The girl's eyes widened in shock, as if she had just realized the depth of those words. She couldn't believe that the past had suddenly surfaced, bringing with it a sense of horror and helplessness. Everything she had thought she had forgotten was now standing before her in full force once again. The girl continued to cry, her tears flowing like a stream, and despite all her attempts to hold back, she could not stop. The second lady, looking at her, realized that her words were not fiction, but the bitter truth. Deep sympathy and sadness were read in her gaze. She sighed, quietly lowering her head and slowly turned to the maid. The girl raised her tear-stained eyes and looked at the lady, trying to find at least a drop of understanding in her gaze. The tears had not yet dried, but the heaviness in her chest did not go away. There was something vulnerable in her gaze, as if she was looking in the eyes of the second lady for at least some confirmation that her feelings had not gone unnoticed. The second lady stood up, her eyes full of determination, but also heavy sadness. She reiterated her words, her voice hard as stone, but still with a hint of concern. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The heaviness in the air felt with every breath. The maid saw the second lady's face change and knew that her patience was wearing thin. She hurried to justify herself, her voice trembling with fear. She repeated that she had not meant to harm the girl, that everything had been done with good intentions. The maid begged for forgiveness, begging the second lady to believe her, but her words sounded like empty noise. The loud slap that rang out in the room shook everything around. The maid was left dumbfounded, her face red from the blow and her eyes frozen in horror. It was unexpected and cruel, but the second lady, clearly at the limit of her patience, could no longer control her emotions. The maid stood there, not knowing what to say or do. The second lady looked at the maid with a cold, assessing gaze that seemed to penetrate her very soul. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were blazing with fury. It was as if all her tolerance had just vanished in an instant. "Get out," she hissed with icy determination. The maid, terrified by such a verdict, did not dare to object. The maid stood there, confused, not knowing what to do next. She couldn't believe that things had come to this extreme. The cheek that had been slapped was throbbing with pain, and every time she looked around the room, her feeling of helplessness only increased. She tried to find some words to justify herself, but everything seemed pointless. The maid, clutching her reddened cheek, still felt the pain. She glanced nervously at the second lady and, with difficulty overcoming her excitement, said, "My lady." Her voice trembled and her eyes were full of despair, but she knew that it was too late to explain anything. The maid felt her words catch in her throat as the second lady studied her with a cold gaze and said that she had been angry at the weak child instead of caring. And now she was even trying to justify her actions. These words pierced the maid to the very heart. She stood there, not knowing what to say, and could not shake off the feeling of guilt. The maid tried to justify herself, but the second lady suddenly burst into tears of anger. Her face became tense, and she screamed that she did not want to listen to this nonsense anymore. There was an irreconcilable rage in her voice, and the maid fell silent, not daring to utter a word. The lady said furiously that the maid was fired and that such people were not needed in the mansion. Her gaze was full of contempt, and she looked down on the maid as if she were something insignificant. The maid, who was standing tense, felt her heart squeezed with fear and shame. A moment of confusion flashed in her eyes. The maid, no longer able to hold back her tears, began to beg the lady not to fire her. She said how sorry she was and how she realized her mistake. But the lady, not listening, sharply shouted at how noisy she was. Her words blew discontent and irritation, and the maid felt her last hope disappear. The lady, no longer able to restrain herself, shouted at the maid again, demanding that she be quiet and not dare to object anymore. There was determination and anger in her voice as she added that she should leave immediately. There was determined contempt in her eyes. The girl watched in amazement, unable to believe that the second lady had defended her so decisively. She had not expected anyone to take her side in this situation. Everything was happening so suddenly and loudly that the girl felt a mixture of relief and bewilderment. The lady knelt down in front of the girl, her gaze soft and soothing. She quietly said that everything would be all right, and as the maid slowly walked away, the room fell silent. The girl felt the weight that had been pressing on her chest for so long begin to ease a little. The lady took the girl's hands gently, her gaze expressing concern and regret. "It must have been hard for you," she said quietly, and there was genuine sadness in her voice. "I'm sorry I didn't take care of you in time. mission. She began to ask the girl why she had not said anything. After all, she had asked her to be frank and to speak if something happened, if she felt bad. She was worried that the girl was silent and that this could possibly be dangerous. But the girl had no idea that there would be anyone in this castle who would actually be willing to take her side. She was used to being ignored, judged, and ignored. All her experience convinced her that she was no different from the shadow that wandered these corridors. Only echoes of pity could be expressed in words, but not in actions. And the girl felt a warmth envelop her as the lady embraced her. Those simple words, spoken with such sincerity, were like a ray of light in her dark world. She confidently declared that she would immediately replace the maid, and Yana almost could not believe what she was hearing. It was the moment when hope for the best began to awaken. The lady continued, assuring the girl that she would not have to endure such an outrage again. She promised that the situation would change and everything would be different. The girl listened silently, carefully watching every movement and word of the woman. There was gratitude in her eyes, but also some confusion, as if she could not fully believe it. The lady said that nothing like that would happen in Tuzlana Castle again. The girl was surprised by these words, but not because of the woman's concern, but because they concerned the owners of the castle. The girl looked at Lady with an anxious look. Her thoughts were confused by the unexpected statement. She asked again, trying to understand the true meaning of Lady's words. The lady, with warmth in her gaze, gently replied that such an outrage would never happen again, at least within the walls of Tuzlana Castle. The girl slowly raised her hand, brushing away the remaining tears, and clenched the fabric in her fist, as if trying to gather all her pain and confusion into this gesture. Her gaze fell on the massive columns and the exquisite stucco ceiling. With alarm in her eyes, she realized, this majestic, cold, and full of mysterious stories mansion? Tuzlana Castle? A place where, it seemed, every corner hides a secret, and the walls seem to whisper about the past. Her thoughts were interrupted by a new realization. Tuzlan was not just a castle. It was a name associated with one of the 4 great families of the Empire. The Tuzlan were considered the most influential family in the Empire. Their name inspired respect and awe. They ruled vast lands. Their wealth and power were limitless. Even the most noble houses recognized their superiority and tried not to enter into conflict with them. But most importantly, in this family, there was a mysterious girl whose story is shrouded in mystery. Who is she? This is the family of St. Clair, a blonde with curls, a neat bob, and green eyes. She was a mysterious person, and her presence always caused surprise and interest. The girl's blood boiled under this realization. Her face turned red with anger, and she clenched her fists. The thought that she could be in this place, in the center of events involving such a powerful family, without any preparation or even awareness, angered her beyond measure. It all seemed unfair, and her rage grew with each passing moment. There were 4 great families in the Empire, each with its own unique influence and power. One of the great families of the Empire was the Golden Bliss Estate. This family was famous not only for its wealth, but also for its cultural heritage, as they were the guardians of art and ancient traditions. Another great estate was called Wisdom Rill. The Rill family was known for their wisdom and deep knowledge, especially in the fields of philosophy and magic. Another great estate was the Honor Estate, Berger. The family was known for its devotion to honor and duty. Their name was associated with uncompromising valor, loyalty, and justice. The main family was the Tuzlan family, also known as the Messengers of God. Their origins were shrouded in myth and legend. Each estate, except Bliss, sent heroes to fight evil. Sabrina of Ryle was a master of magic and divination, preferring to avoid violence. Tion of Berger was a mighty warrior whose fighting skills inspired his allies to victory. Both heroes became symbols of courage and fortitude. But from the Tuzlan estate, St. Clara was sent. Her nobility and boundless faith attracted admiration, and her spiritual strength and wisdom were known throughout the Empire. She was a symbol of purity and service to the greater good. Her presence inspired those who were near. When the girl lived in her previous life, she and Clara were friends and communicated quite well. Despite the difference in status, they often met and had many common topics for conversation. The girl always admired her strength and determination, and she in turn appreciated the girl's kindness and sincerity. She bore the title of saint with dignity, and they were truly wonderful companions. But there was one but. Clara was hiding something important that the girl could not understand. Although her actions were always noble and correct, something in her behavior and decisions made the girl doubt. She was the one who betrayed the girl. This betrayal was deeply etched in her memory, leaving a trace of disappointment and pain. Despite her outward virtue, Clara was part of what destroyed trust and hope, forcing the girl to reconsider everything she knew about her friends. The girl thought. Her face darkened, and feeling a growing sense of unease, she instinctively put her hand to her mouth, trying to suppress her emotions. Remembering Clara's betrayal, she could not understand how she could have been so wrong in her judgments of people she had once trusted. The lady, noticing the anxiety on the girl's face, came closer and asked her with concern what was the matter, whether she was hiding something and whether everything was okay. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were wary. She could not ignore that the girl was going through something important. The girl smiled and said that she was fine. But inside her, a cunning plan was brewing that might change her destiny. She was not going to stay in the shadows any longer and let everyone control her life. She said that she even felt better, and her smile became a little creepy. After all, if she really was from the Taislin family, it would be much easier to figure out her past life. Now she had a goal, and all she needed was time and the right moment to act. In the Taislin estate, where theocracy reigns, the family wields incredible power. They bear the title of messengers of the gods, and their word has the power equal to the will of the god himself. The place is filled with sacred respect and awe, and their influence extends far beyond their mansion. And since the Taislin family sent their hero, it will be easier for the girl to learn the whole truth about the past. She will become stronger, and she will definitely take revenge. The desire to return justice grew in her heart, because now she has all the means to break the shackles of the past and return to herself what was taken from her. But she would start with Clara and Aureliana. These two were closely connected to her past, and it was through them that she hoped to find answers to her questions. After all, if she could understand their actions and motives, then perhaps she would find the key to unraveling the whole story and understand what really happened in her past. But first, Sabrina and Tion. The girl clenched her teeth in anger, her gaze darkening. She knew that these two were part of what happened to her, and now that she had regained her strength, it was time to deal with them. Anger overwhelmed her, but this was her chance to find answers and take back everything that had been taken from her. The lady happily embraced the little girl. Her warmth and care were like a light in a dark tunnel. She felt the second lady's tenderness and support fill her, even though her heart was full of dark thoughts. But at that moment, the girl could forget for a moment, feel safe. The girl looked at the lady with a sad expression on her face, her eyes full of anxiety and uncertainty. The woman, noticing her condition, continued with concern that she was afraid that the girl would lose consciousness again. The lady, with a warm and caring look, asked the girl to tell her about her experiences next time. She added that she and her husband would always be on her side. The girl's eyes widened in surprise at these words, not expecting such support and warmth. The lady hugged the girl tighter and said, "If you're having a hard time, you can rely on us." She hugged the girl with all her heart, trying to convey all her care and support to her. She felt genuinely sorry for the girl because she saw how much pain and fear was hidden in her eyes, and she wanted to help her cope with it. She turned to the girl, but she remained silent, resting her head on the woman's shoulder. The silence dragged on, broken only by the girl's light breathing. Finally, after a while, the girl slowly raised her head and nodded, agreeing with her, though her eyes were full of unspoken emotion. All that remained was silence. She gently ran her hand over her cheek, feeling the girl tremble under her touch, and said quietly, "Get up." Her voice was full of tenderness and care, as if she was trying to convey at least a drop of her confidence to the girl. She smiled, but her eyes were worried, because it was hard for her to look at such a frightened girl. The lady smiled tenderly, looking at the little one. She slowly extended her hand to the girl. Her voice was calm and confident when she said that she had to take her to a special place. The girl, not hiding her surprise, looked at her carefully and, unable to contain her curiosity, asked, "Where?" The lady said that the uncle had asked to see the girl. The girl's eyes widened at these words and she froze, not believing her ears. Her heart sank and her thoughts became confused. Why did the uncle want to see her? She could not understand what was happening and looked at the woman in confusion, the girl thought, trying to comprehend the words. So this was one of the brothers who raised her? But why did he suddenly decide to look for her after all these years? The questions literally burst out, and the answers seemed so distant and incomprehensible, like the fog in her head. It was all strange. The woman looked at her with tenderness and love, as if trying to hide her anxiety, and said that since she had eaten a poisonous fruit, he probably wanted to make sure she was okay. It must be tough for you, she added sympathetically. Then, pulling herself together, she asked if she would go with her. The girl thought even more. Her thoughts were confused. The woman was asking her, who had just come to after losing consciousness, to go somewhere, and this seemed very strange and frightening. With each passing minute, the feeling of anxiety grew stronger, and the girl could not understand what exactly was waiting for her behind this unexpected offer, and this made the girl think a lot. She couldn't understand the meaning of what was happening. Her thoughts were confused, and she didn't know what to do. The whole situation seemed strange and even dangerous to her. The girl silently looked at the woman, unable to find an answer or ask a question. It all seemed strange, even very strange. Could it be that this lady wasn't a good hero in the game either? She smiled slightly, as if she had decided something for herself, and with a small amount of confidence said that she would go. There was no fear or doubt in her voice, only a firm intention. She already felt how anxiety retreated, and taking a step forward, she directed the woman herself, confidently leading her along. Everything that was happening seemed strange. They walked down the corridor, quietly holding hands, and the girl was lost in her thoughts. The certainty was growing in her head that in order to take revenge, she needed to secure the family's power. But to do this, she would have to establish her place in the estate, and this was not so simple. An internal plan was emerging, and her every action had to be thought out. She needed to understand who this uncle really was, what was behind his intentions, and why he was so interested in her fate. Her thoughts were confused, but the girl tried to concentrate. Suddenly, she noticed that they had already approached the doors. They were right in front of them, and the moment when she would meet this man was about to come. They entered the room, and the girl, hiding all her feelings, made a neutral, calm face. Inside her, thoughts were raging, but she tried not to show it. She looked around the room in confusion, not paying attention to the details, but rather trying to figure out what would happen next and what awaited her in this strange place. The future head of the family sat on a chair near the easel in a formal suit. He was not exactly young, but his face radiated confidence and power, and his eyes showed experience. There was neither tension nor relaxation in his pose, only a calm readiness for any turn of events. He was painting a majestic picture with paints. She stood next to the lady, her heart beating faster, when the lady, noticing her gaze, called out to the man. He, not paying attention at first, raised his head, and the lady said his name. His name was Roman. For a moment, the room was silent, the whole atmosphere filled with heaviness. The girl was wondering what could happen. The man turned to face them, lifting his face, and his stern features became tense. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his gaze became piercing, as if he was trying to figure out who was in front of him and what they were going to do. The atmosphere in the room immediately changed, as if his presence made the air heavier. Why did he want to see her? He looked at them, assessing them with every glance. He was not very young, but not old either. He had dark blonde hair, close to chestnut, and strict features that did not show unnecessary emotions. Green eyes seemed to be able to penetrate the very soul. He addressed them with a slight tilt of his head and said, "Here you are." His voice was calm. The girl greeted her uncle politely, slightly anxiously, her heart beating faster. Her voice was calm, but her gaze betrayed her anxiety. Inside, she tried to pull herself together, but the anxiety still did not leave her. She thought that he was already the second son in the Tuslin estate. She froze in anticipation. The girl, with a slight retort, began to look around the room, her gaze sliding to every corner, trying to catch something important. She felt that there was something here that could help her understand what was going on, and perhaps she would notice some key element that would reveal the answers to her questions. The girl looked around and noticed a large painting in a golden frame that immediately caught her attention. It looked truly majestic, as if it The girl wondered, was her uncle really into painting? It seemed like a rather unique talent. The painting depicted high mountains and a small house. The man also greeted the girl, his voice reserved but polite. He apologized for calling her suddenly, explaining that he had not meant to disturb her. "I heard that you had just recently recovered from the poisoning," he added, his gaze attentive as if he were searching for a reaction to her words. He looked at her carefully and asked with a slight expression of concern, "How are you feeling?" The girl, trying to hide her concern, answered calmly, "Fine." Her voice sounded confident, but there was still a slight worry in her eyes. She didn't quite know what to expect from this man. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. The man said with a slight note of concern in his voice that he thought she understood how worried they were about her. His gaze was attentive, but not intrusive. A woman stood behind her, quietly observing the conversation. She had been listening quietly to them the entire time, not interfering, but her presence was felt in the room, as if she were ready to intervene. He said sternly that she could wear expensive clothes and live in such luxury thanks to their hard work. His voice was firm and his gaze was cold enough, as if he wanted to emphasize the importance of his words. Each of his words sounded like a reminder that everything she had was the result of the work and efforts of those around her. The girl watched what was happening with her big blue eyes. There was a wariness in her gaze, and she did not like her uncle's maneuver at all. She felt that his words were not just information, but a real reproach. Her heart sank, but she tried to hide it, trying not to show her dissatisfaction. But the man, despite his obvious displeasure, continued. His voice became even firmer as he said that no one else would have taken care of her like that except for them. His words sounded like a statement, as if to suggest that she should be grateful for their care and attention, even if it was not what she expected. The girl stood silently, not knowing what to say. Thoughts were spinning rapidly in her head, but she understood that this information was given to her for a reason, and every word she said could have consequences. Anxiety was mixed with confusion, and she could not immediately find a suitable answer. She felt that this man clearly wanted something. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Thoughts of gratitude flashed through her mind, but they could not find their expression. She felt that these words were inappropriate, and everything that came out of her mouth seemed too empty or insincere. And the girl understood that all this was pathetic manipulation. In her head, this moment seemed unnatural and cunning, and she felt that they were trying to somehow subjugate her or influence her decision. But she could not hide her inner resistance, realizing that these words and actions were thought out and with hidden intentions. They reproach her for what they gave to the child, that is, to her, and as if reminding her that she should be grateful for their efforts. But this woman, who once showed gratitude and care, now remained silent, unwilling to stand up for the girl. This only increased her feeling of loneliness because before she could count on her support, which was no longer there, the girl looked at them with an annoying expression, disappointment in her eyes. Everything that was happening seemed disgusting to her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was surrounded by lies and manipulation. Thoughts about how strange and unfair it all was didn't leave her, and she could hardly contain her irritation. They were very vile, as was their behavior, but the girl overcame herself, gathered her strength, and slightly bowing her head, bowed to the man. In a calm voice, she said, "Of course, I am always grateful, Uncle." There was no sincerity in her words, but she knew that the situation required it, and the uncle continued to sit without changing his expression, calmly watching her gesture. The man smiled his insincere smile, and it seemed that this grin did not reach his eyes. He said that he was glad that she was a smart girl, and therefore he wanted her to answer honestly. His voice sounded slightly cold, and his gaze was penetrating, as if he was trying to fish out the truth, regardless of how she really felt. He turned to her, and with a curious and slightly mocking look, asked if it was the third son who sent her to the greenhouse and told her to eat the fruit. This question greatly surprised the girl, and she froze for a moment, not knowing how to answer it. She did not understand at all what was being discussed, and her thoughts instantly became confused, not knowing what exactly was hidden behind this question. The girl stood there, completely confused, not understanding what she was about to learn. The question about the third uncle had confused her, and she could not understand why he had suddenly started talking about him. Hundreds of thoughts were spinning in her head, but none of them explained what it all meant and what her uncle was trying to find out. It was rather strange behavior. The girl tilted her head, trying to figure out what the reason for his question was. Her mind was full of questions, but there was no answer. The man stood in front of her, looking at her carefully, as if waiting for her to find the right answer, or at least show her reaction. His gaze was penetrating. The girl clenched her hands into fists, trying to concentrate, and began to think about the whole situation. The atmosphere in the room was becoming heavier and heavier, as if the air had thickened, and each breath she took was difficult. Everything that was happening seemed unnatural to her, and her heart began to beat faster from the tension. She tried to figure out what to say. The girl remembered how she went to the greenhouse, ate the poisonous fruit, and lost consciousness. And now she was being asked if her third son had ordered her to do it. The question sounded so strange that she couldn't help but think, why the third son? Why was she, having eaten this fruit, at the center of this conversation? Thoughts were spinning in her head. She tried to connect all the events into a single picture. Heavenly fruit, the greenhouse. All of this somehow echoed, but where did the third son fit in? The girl felt that something was eluding her understanding. Why him? Why this question now? Every word the man said seemed important, but she could not find a logical connection. The girl finally understood something. She understood the rules of the game. Everything was becoming clearer. His questions, his cold behavior, and now that she understood, she felt even more uncomfortable. He, in turn, was in no hurry to interfere with her thoughts. With a smile, not entirely kind, he continued to look at her as if waiting. He began to talk to the girl, his voice calm, but there was an underlying tension in it. He urged her to answer honestly, repeating that it was this man who had sent her to the greenhouse and told her to eat that very fruit. His gaze was penetrating. He carefully watched her every move as if he knew. The girl continued to look at the man in shock, unable to believe what she had heard. Her eyes showed surprise and confusion. She tried to comprehend his words, but everything seemed too unexpected and strange. Every word the man said echoed in her mind, but she could not find a logical explanation for what was happening. The man continued, his voice even more confident and cold. "Not everyone can get in here," he said, as if to emphasize the importance of the moment. "And you, a good girl, wouldn't do that. That means someone threatened you." His words sounded like an accusation, and the girl felt her tension increase. It was all a game. "Let me ask again." The words burst out of the man as if he couldn't stop himself. He asked again if her uncle had ordered her. The girl stood silently. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she didn't know what to answer. The answer seemed so important, but in her head there was only confusion. Each word of the man became more and more pressing. They looked at each other, and a tense silence hung between them. The girl still did not understand what she should answer. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for some kind of answer, but the words did not come. She felt the pressure on her increasing with each passing moment, and her heart beat faster from confusion. The man looked at the girl with a rather sly smile, his eyes full of expectation. He was already anticipating the moment when she would finally say her answer. He felt that it was difficult for her, but there was something exciting about it. His confidence that she would answer seemed indisputable. His every movement, every glance was directed at her. He looked down at her, with a hint of disdain in his eyes, already waiting for her to finally agree. He felt that the moment was approaching, and that the girl would soon give in under the pressure of his gaze. His confidence in this was obvious, and he continued to watch her as a player who, in his opinion, would inevitably give in. This family's greenhouse was not just a garden. It was called the Garden of Deadly Poison. This place hid many dangerous plants that you would not easily find in nature. Every corner of the greenhouse was filled with poisonous flowers and herbs collected from the most remote corners of the world. It was a real family treasure, carefully guarded. The man nervously fiddled with his fingers, his face reflecting the inner tension. He had tried to keep this place under control for a long time, protecting his secrets and carefully hiding his emotions. Every gesture, every movement seemed measured and careful, as if he was afraid that something would get out of his control. This place was mysterious to him, but deep down inside the man, other feelings were seething. That shameless brother of his is always throwing his fist at my greenhouse. These thoughts were swirling restlessly in his head. He could not bear the fact that someone might dare to threaten or interfere with what he guarded so carefully. The greenhouse was his pride and secret. The brother's name was Gregory, and in the eyes of his second brother, he was very bad. His presence always irritated and worried the man, because in the opinion of his relative, he was the one who disturbed the peace, undermined the foundations, and did not respect the family traditions. Every action of his seemed a deliberate threat to what the man so carefully protected. The man was sure that this incident had been staged to take the greenhouse away from him. He saw it as a conspiracy, a carefully planned operation, the purpose of which was to deprive him of what he had guarded for so long and so stubbornly. All other explanations and justifications seemed to him to be just pointless attempts to hide the true intentions. He thought that this time he would not leave things as they were, and would act differently than in the past, when he was part of the Holy Knight's Order. Now he was ready to play by his own rules, without adhering to the old ideals and codes. His past attempts to stay within the bounds of honesty and morality had failed, and now he decided to act decisively. But he smiled, and his face took on a slight, almost imperceptible, sinister grin as he waited for her to finally say everything. He knew the moment was approaching, and he was sure that the girl would eventually admit who was behind all the events. The main thing was for her to say that it was he who had arranged this whole situation. There was confidence in his eyes, but the girl still stood silently and watched him. Her gaze was calm, but inside, conflicting feelings raged. She could not decide on an answer, not knowing what it could mean for her. His smile, filled with expectation, did not make her give in. Instead of giving in to his pressure, she remained silent. The girl's mouth opened, and this was the moment the man had been waiting for. His gaze became even more penetrating. He carefully followed her every word, as if he felt that she was about to say what he needed. There was a tense silence in the air, and he was sure that now she would not be able to hide the truth, which was obvious. But the girl said no. It was an answer the man had not expected. His face froze for a moment, and surprise flashed in his eyes. He could not believe that she dared to answer like that, because everything was ready for a confession. The tension in the room increased, and the man, although he maintained an outward calm, the man looked at the girl in surprise. He had not expected such an answer at all, and for a moment his confidence wavered. His eyes narrowed, and his face turned slightly pale from surprise. Everything he had prepared and built in his head now seemed meaningless. He tried to understand what was behind her word, no. He did not like this turn of events. The girl smiled and calmly said that the third uncle had not forced or asked her to do anything. Her words sounded confident despite all the tension of the moment. The man, hearing her answer, froze for a moment. He did not know what to think because she seemed sincere, and her calmness cast doubt on everything he expected. After a while, the man smiled a sly smile. He was still sure that he was right, despite her words. His gaze became even more confident, and he himself seemed ready to accept her refusal as part of the game. He knew that sooner or later she would still say what he needed. His face was pale, it looked frightening. The girl was still standing there, smiling, and the man thought how stupid she was to think he would believe her words. He watched her reaction carefully, realizing that she either didn't realize the seriousness of the situation or was simply trying to deceive him. A hint of contempt appeared in his eyes. He was sure that she was hiding something more. Did she really think he would believe such an obvious lie? The man chuckled to himself, feeling how her attempts to deceive him only made the situation worse. He knew that her words were nothing more than a childish attempt to hide the truth. At this point, his patience was wearing thin, and he was ready to call her out on it. But the girl immediately realized after that question that the two brothers were in conflict. Everything came together in her head. Everything that was happening was not just random, but part of some deeper feud between them. She began to realize that her own role in this conflict was perhaps more important than she could have imagined. The brother tried to frame his third son, saying that he was the ringleader. There is no stronger evidence than the confession of a victim who narrowly escaped death. It was a carefully calculated manipulation aimed at shifting the blame onto him. The man was sure that her words, as expected, would be perceived as confirmation of his version. Yana really ate the fruit on someone's orders? The girl thought about it. The thought that her actions could be part of someone else's game made her anxious. She tried to imagine who could use her, and what consequences this could have for her. Were all the coincidences accidental? Or was she deliberately drawn into this conflict? And what if this had something to do with Lynn waking up in the body of a little girl? The thought struck her. Maybe this was all part of a larger plan that she had been caught up in without her knowledge. Maybe her transfer into the girl's body and the poisonous fruit incident had something to do with whoever was manipulating her destiny. It was too weird, but of course these were only the girl's assumptions for now. She couldn't be sure of her thoughts because it was all too confusing and unclear. However, she understood that she needed to think about it, because every little thing could be important in the future. Perhaps this was a key to the mystery that she hadn't realized yet. The girl thought that in order to get closer to the truth, she first had to deny her uncle's words and wait for some memories to arise again. She understood that the main thing now was not to rush to conclusions. By rejecting his version, she could discover new, hidden details that would lead her to the true picture of what was happening. He grabbed his head, not understanding what to say now. After all, his part of the plan had failed. But inside his mind, a new strategy was already being built. He knew that he could bring the girl to clean water. He just needed to wait a little bit for her to give herself away. He was sure that he was not mistaken, and that this step would be decisive in his game. He asked if the girl was sure of what she was saying. She confirmed it with a smile, but her confidence seemed less solid than she was trying to show. The woman was standing behind her, and her expression was worried. The woman was clearly worried about something, and it seemed like her words might be hiding more than she was letting on. The man frowned and asked with displeasure in his voice, why had she then secretly entered the greenhouse? It had been part of his plan, and now everything was not going as he had expected. His question was sharp, like a reproach, and he felt that the girl was hiding something. This step could be the key to the solution, and he was sure that her answers now would be decisive. And he also asked why she had eaten the poisonous fruit. The girl folded her arms and thought about how to justify herself in this situation. There were too many thoughts in her head, but she understood that each of her answers would be carefully analyzed. It was necessary to find a way out so as not to give herself away, but also not to reveal all the cards. The girl said with some anxiety that she was just curious, because in books they write that the fruit has a divine taste. So she decided to check. Her voice trembled a little, but she tried to look confident. However, she knew that his question was not accidental, and her answer might not convince him. But despite everything, she did not give up. His eyes widened at her answer, not expecting such an excuse. The girl felt his gaze piercing her, and she couldn't understand what he would think next. It was a little unexpected for her, because her words could seem so innocent, but deep suspicion was already visible in the man's eyes. The man finally stood up from his chair in rage, his face turning red, and he stepped forward as if he was ready to let out all his anger. The girl, feeling the tension, barely held her breath, her mouth slightly open in anticipation of what would happen next. The lady stood to the side, not knowing where to go, her gaze darting from the man to the girl. The man clenched his fist, and this made the girl tense. His eyes narrowed, and his voice became cold and menacing as he began to shout, "Curious?" He stepped forward, and the atmosphere in the room became even more tense. The girl instinctively retreated, feeling her heart begin to beat faster. The lady standing nearby did not dare to intervene. "You swallowed a poisonous fruit because of something so stupid? Do you think I'll believe that?" The man shouted, his face contorted with anger. He was blushing with every passing second. Every look and word he gave literally tore through the silence. The girl stood there, feeling her confidence melt under his anger. It was a tense moment. Finally, the lady stepped into the conversation, deciding to stand up for the girl. She stepped forward, trying to ease the tension, and quietly but firmly asked the man to stop yelling. Her voice was soft, but there was determination in it. The lady turned to the girl as if she wanted to give her a chance to justify herself, and then turned her attention back to the man. The man continued to scream, his anger unabated. He had lost the greenhouse. It was his pain and disappointment that he could not contain. His words were full of rage, and his The woman, despite his rage, approached him, trying to stop him at least for a moment. And suddenly the girl realized that this was not just a family quarrel. She had a feeling that behind it there was a conflict for something very valuable. Perhaps it was not only the greenhouse, but also something much more important. Something that determined their position